Birutė, you've been involved with orangutans for a very long time. You've become an icon for orangutans in Indonesia. How did you originally become involved in orangutans and research and conservation?
Well, I became involved with orangutans because there was something about them that spoke to me. So even when I was a youngster, I felt a connection with them through the power of their eyes, through their gaze. So I wanted to go and study them. And of course, the moment you start studying them, you realize that they're in grave danger of extinction as populations in the wild. So I started my conservation work almost at the same time that I started studying them in the wilds of Borneo. My goals during the first year were to begin a study of individual life histories, to habituate wild orangutans, to set up a rehabilitation program, and to start increasing the awareness of local people about orangutans, and to start a tourism industry in the local area. Because I knew, even then, that unless the local people got something from orangutans in the forests of Tanjung Puting National Park, they would prefer to eliminate the forest, make rice fields. The major focus now should be maintaining and protecting biologically viable populations of wild orangutans. That's where we should concentrate our efforts on, plus protecting smaller populations that are interesting or significant in other ways. Now, if I had my way, every single wild orangutan would get a police escort. I would want to protect every single one of them, and that's what we try to do. In our rehabilitation program, we never turn an orangutan or any animal down. In terms of conservation, we need to protect the biologically viable populations in Borneo and in Sumatra. In Borneo, you basically only have 3 or 4 parks where the populations are large enough that they are truly biologically viable populations of orangutans that will survive into the future and allow the normal processes of evolution to occur. There's just a few biologically viable populations of wild orangutans left. Those are the ones we need to save. The Tanjung Puting one is relatively safe, as wild populations go, and increasingly the one in Sumbango is becoming relatively safe. But we also need to try and make sure that some of the other populations that are different subspecies reach those...
viability, yeah.
Maintain viability, exactly. You took the words out of my mouth.
These animals are protected nationally and internationally, but how much does that actually transpire on the ground in terms of implementation?
Well, there's a disconnect. And one of the most powerful instruments, one of the most powerful tools for influencing local people, whoever they might be, is the intimate encounter with the animal. In this case, the intimate encounter with the orangutans. When people actually interact with orangutans, when they're very close to them, and there's no bars, suddenly they get epiphanies. Suddenly it changes the way they think about things.
Yeah, no, definitely. You can't replace, TV can't replace the importance and the charisma of these animals. And when people are actually faced with this, they're totally bowled over and they totally buy into it because they see how like us orangutans are.
Exactly. They come to an understanding that orangutans really are us, except for a few bits and pieces of DNA. You can tell them 100 times over, but when they actually sit next to an orangutan or hold an orangutan's hand, and the orangutan gazes into their eyes, a shift occurs in their perception of what these animals really are. And it's a very powerful shift. I've seen it happen over and over again with government officials. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens a lot.
So we have about well over 1,000 orangutans in rehabilitation centres in Kalimantan alone, in Indonesian Kalimantan. You've been successful at reintroducing orangutans back into the wild. What would you say would be the percentage of success?
I was just looking at some data recently about our 40 years of work in Camp Leakey And the main thing is for them to survive into adolescence. Now, if you start from the beginning and you include those forlorn infants that come into your arms, who are barely alive, or those forlorn infants that have fingers missing or wounds on their body, or when you open them up after they die, their lungs are totally black from pneumonia or tuberculosis. If you count those, then the success rate is much lower. But once you get them to adolescence, the success rate is quite high.
And how do you generally monitor orangutans that you have re-released in the past?
Well, initially we follow them, and when we encounter them in the forest, or if they come back to camp, we follow them again. And so some of them, you really don't know. I mean, some of them disappear and you never see them again. So did they die or did they survive? It's a guess, it's a crapshoot, you don't really know. But I've had enough experiences now to indicate to me that most of them do survive. What am I talking about? I'm talking about you release, a male who's maybe an adolescent, young adolescent, and then 10 years later, you meet an adult male, and he looks at you, and there's something in his eyes. He recognizes you. You don't quite recognize him. And he doesn't run away from you. You think now, who could that be? They sometimes have very small marks on them, or they have a particular kind of belly button, or they have something weird in their ears, and you can usually figure it out. You could hand them a banana, and they would look you straight in the eyes and take it from your hand. That has to be a wild-born ex-captive. I mean, that is not a wild orangutan.
There is still a trade, a legal trade in infant orangutans across borders to, for example, Malaysia and to countries outside. How much of a threat is that still? Although it's been pretty well publicized now, does that still pose a very large threat to orangutan survival?
It poses a threat. I mean, it poses a threat because if every year you lose 1% of your population, pretty soon you can do the math. It's like interest. The power of compound interest. If every year you get a 1% on your money, eventually you're going to double your money. So the same thing is true of the pet trade. 2-3% of the population gone every year because that one orangutan that crosses the border, his or her mother was killed, and probably a lot of other mothers and infants were killed to get that one alive. If you're talking Sumatran orangutans, I mean 7,000, figure it out. If you're taking 2% of 7,000 every year, or 3%, how many years do you have left? Yes. And I suspect that it's actually larger than 2 or 3%, because what it means is you have people hunting the mothers.
And like you say, for every baby that actually survives, in horrendous conditions normally, transported across borders, in terrible tiny enclosures for long periods of time with the incorrect food and nutrition, several babies die just in that process alone.
Virtually none survive. What we're seeing in terms of the orangutan infants that come to rehabilitation centers, we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. How do I know? I know because we cooperate with the police, local police, and when the local police are informed that there's an orangutan being held in captivity, they go out. So many times those police officers go upriver into the forest, these little remote villages, now increasingly in palm oil plantations, and they say, oh yeah, we got one orangutan, but the owner had another one that just died.
In terms of orangutans being either killed or captured or traded, there's been so few prosecutions. Clearly that needs to change for people to change their practices as well.
Well, I think the culture needs to change. I think the culture, which is one that traditionally avoided conflict and confrontation, is one that doesn't really offer encouragement for enforcement agencies to say, well, you killed an orangutan, therefore you've got to go to jail. I think the culture has to change in the sense that orangutans have to be made more important to the general public. And of course that's going to be a relatively long process, but I actually think that we're beginning to see the beginnings of that change. I think education is the key. And an example is, in my husband's village, my husband is a Dayak, traditionally people ate orangutans. When my husband was a boy, he tasted orangutans, he ate orangutans, just part of the culture. But now you go into the interior of Borneo, or you go to my husband's village, and the young people don't eat orangutan because it's not modern. They understand that's part of a way they don't want to follow because they've been educated. Part of that education, I have to say, has come from NGOs going into the schools.
Yeah, a recent study by CIFOR shows that if you have civil society buy-in, you're going to be much more successful in your conservation efforts, and I think that goes across the globe. If you don't have local buy-in, then it's very difficult to control these things.
Exactly, especially if traditional culture allowed for and encouraged the eating of wildlife such as orangutans. So once people learn that orangutans are protected, and they learn about the fact that orangutans share 97% of their genetic material with us, are exposed to them, like I mentioned, you know, in intimate encounters in places like Camp Leakey and Tanjung Puting National Park, their attitudes really change. And again, it's this, one of the best things that NGOs can do is go into the schools, go into the villages, you know, go into the women's cooperatives, and talk about conservation and talk about what orangutans do for the environment and who orangutans are. The main problem for orangutans is people kill them. So if there was national enforcement of the Don't Kill the Orangutans law, then orangutans actually might not even need as protected areas in the same way they need them now. Because the main function of protected areas is not just to save the forest, it's also to save the wildlife within them.
I guess, of course, the worry is that as these areas shrink in size and they do become islands, and the human orangutan conflict becomes so much more visible, we, in essence, are forcing them into these tiny pockets where they can't survive, and so they are going out to oil palm plantations, they are going out to acacia forests, they are going into people's farms. And without that form of education, then people just don't know how to deal with it. And as you say, they become pests and people shoot them.
Yeah, and people are afraid of them. They're big. An adult male is 300 pounds easy. So, yeah, local people are afraid of them. And also they can't be bothered with them. You know, if you have some orangutan raiding your garden, after a while it gets monotonous. It gets, you know, you go out and shoot it, or you go shoot him or her, or you call the local police. So it is these human orangutan conflicts are going to increase, and they are going to cause problems. And this is why we absolutely need to get the conservation curriculum into the local schools and into the local villages. It's not just the children, it's also all levels of society, which is why television programs are good, which is why newspaper articles are good, magazine articles. So OFI publishes, I can't call it, it's like a magazine-like newsletter. It looks like a mini version of National Geographic. You know, every page is glossy, it has pictures, and what we find is that we go into a village, you know, a year or 2 years after we distributed this newsletter, and the people still have it. They're still reading it. Yeah, so education, all levels. We need to do more.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems is that we're not doing things fast enough, and at the level that we are doing them at the moment, with all the different education components trying to be implemented, lobbying government, local communities, without speeding that up, in essence, where do you think we're going to be in 20 or 30 years?
No, we will fail. We need to make it exciting. We need to make it interesting. You need to involve people with nature. I think it's not just an orangutan issue. I think it's a much bigger issue. You need to bring nature back into people's lives, and when nature is brought back into people's lives, people are much happier and much more content. And there's all kinds of studies that indicate that is true.